is Alden Rivendale Jones, and today, I'm being quiet now because we don't want to disturb him, but today we've come across Dan O'Sullivan, and we're going to interview him. So stick with us, don't leave that seat, and don't touch that dial. Hello and welcome, everyone. Okay, so Dano, you've worked at Apple, you invented physical computing, and you ran your own consulting business for several years. But most notably, you've been involved with the Interactive Telecommunications Program for the better part of the past 30 years. Could you talk a little bit about your history of the department, how you got started, and how you went on this journey of being in charge?
Yeah, I was at a bar in the East Village. I think it's called the Holiday Cocktail Lounge. It might still be there. I was with an old friend. I guess all my friends weren't as old as they are now, but he said, I was telling him what I thought about the future, and he said, there's a program called ITP, and they don't require a GRE. That's how I wound up at ITP. Pretty rare, But anyway, So, I kept trying to escape, but I just, kept wanting to do stuff, and so I'd come in all night long. Back then you could smoke inside. And so I would just sit there in a room and smoke all night long because, of course, I couldn't afford a computer, and they had computers. And eventually Red Burns, who, of course, founded the program, felt sorry for me and started paying me.
Is that why you stuck around so long, just for the free computer use? Or what else about ITP made you stay?
I'll say the company.
From my understanding, you are the progenitor of YORB, and so you had a hand in its start. And but I've also heard about this thing that existed before YORB called Dan's Apartment, which I think was another show that showcased your apartment.
Yeah.
So could you talk about Dan's Apartment and then how Dan's Apartment became YORB?
Yeah. One thing you mentioned in my intro that I invented physical computing and YORB, and I definitely named those two things. I think maybe I picked names that stick. Like I didn't pick ITP. That wasn't a very good name. Like the web, ITP, Interactive Telecommunications, they were trying to, they saw the web on the horizon 15 years off. And the best name they could come up with was Interactive Telecommunications. And, the web is much catchier. So I named those two things. Obviously, physical computing, Tom Igoe, and, a lot of other people have had a much bigger, effect in bringing to life. But yeah, YORB was kind of a secondary project to a project called Dan's Apartment. Back then, there was this technology called a laser disc. And the thing, it was like a vinyl record because it was analog. But the revolutionary technology was, how you have the stylus on a record player? Well, you guys might not even know that, but you used to have a stylus on a record player. And you could, pop between tracks. And the stylus was computerized, so it popped between tracks very quickly. So that was random access, which at the time was really radical. So it wasn't digital, but it was random access. And so we had one of those, and it played video. And, I had this notion of I have all these photos in a box, in a shoebox, and they're organized by year. But what if they were organized also by person? What if they were organized by place? And it's hard to believe that now, but that was impossible. It's good. That seems like a pretty easy thing to do, but and the Laserdisc could accomplish that. And so I pressed the laser disc to scan all my photos, and so that took up about 5 minutes of 30 minutes of laser disc, and I didn't know what to do. So me and a friend got like a granny cart and just traveled around my apartment, every single possible path through my apartment, and captured my apartment in video, which that also was something that wasn't done that much. There was a project earlier that inspired me called the Aspen Project. A guy named Michael Neymark with MIT went out to Aspen and attached a camera to a car and just drove all around Aspen. And then on, again, a laser disc, you could feel what it was like to drive around Aspen. So instead of driving around Aspen, we drove around my apartment. And then Red Burns had arranged, Red was a really interesting character. She saw, you've probably heard me tell this story a million times. She saw somebody with a videotape camera and said, that's revolutionary. So the revolution when she started ITP was videotape, here linear videotape. And that was going to change the world. And so she got involved with, video cameras, but also public access for broadcasting them. So public access was the notion that, cable is more or less a monopoly in a given city. So the city negotiates that people should be able to have some ability to broadcast along with the big corporate interests. And Red, testified in Washington, was a big proponent of making that happen. In the end, Red actually had very high-class taste and couldn't stand watching public television. But she did manage to get something that was really astounding at the time, because remember, public access was a result of like municipal negotiations, and what she got, she just went to the president of, I forget what it was called back then, maybe Time Warner Cable or something. No, it couldn't have been Time Warner. It was Manhattan Cable. And he agreed to allow an origination point out of ITP, which was very unusual. So I went ahead and put my apartment on TV, on Access. And one of the funny things at that point was, when you watch TV, you still tuned between the channels. You went up channels and down channels. Mm-hmm. And channel 3 was always reserved for like the input of your VCR into your TV set or something like that. So it was always a blank channel. And that was our channel on cable, which meant that when people were, and our time was like 11:30 at night. And so when people were flipping between, I think Johnny Carson had just gone off and it was Jay Leno, and I forget who was on 2, maybe it was Letterman. They were flipping between the late night shows. In between was our show. So we literally had, the internet's pretty impressive, but it was impressive for us. We had, hundreds of thousands of viewers a night. And it was this ridiculous show where you would call in and, either touch tones or your voice would navigate you around my apartment. And the interface for navigating around the apartment was the genesis of physical computing. So figuring out how to go from touch tones or voice commands into a serial port was what I was doing in that conference room, smoking cigarettes all night, getting to work. But in any case, at the time, it was a very unusual thing to see on TV. It was an unusual thing to see at all. Random access video, being able to navigate through a physical space in video, and so I had about 15 minutes of fame. I was on TV. I get written up in the New Yorker. I was famous. Yeah. And so then, Apple hired me as a summer intern, I guess, based on that. And then I just repeated that project for them. And it was called, it became a product out of Apple called QuickTime VR. So VR at the time was in the first craze, and we're feeling echoes of that now. And so this was a poor man's VR. Back then, to do VR, you needed, literally a $40,000 machine. And so this was using photography instead of rendering to generate. It's the equivalent of what people call today, 360 video. Mm-hmm. Of course, it couldn't be video back then. It was just 360 photographs. But that was revolutionary, and Apple came out with that product. And so kind of Dan's apartment led to my work at Apple.
Cool. I would argue that what we're in right now is a poor man's version of VR of the current era.
Which is a good thing. That's what the department's all about, right? Democratizing media. The poorer the person we're serving, the better job we're doing.
After your work at Apple, Dan's apartment ended up becoming YORB. What were you involved in that shift at all, or do you know how it became sort of a short-term institution for the department?
Yeah. So what happened was, I was still working for Apple, but I wanted to live in New York, so I moved back to New York, and I was still working for Apple, and Red kind of tempted me back into to ITP, and so I proposed a project. I was a little bit of a boy, looking for toys, and like I said, VR required a $40,000 computer, what was called a Silicon graphics machine, to work. And so what we did was we put in a proposal to what is now Verizon, back then was called, I think, 9X. And they gave us $100,000 to experiment, which was a ton of money. So I put together a proposal. We ended up it was an interesting arrangement. We worked with the medical school, who actually had one of those $40,000 computers. And then there was a piece of dark fiber that came under the morgue all the way down to 721 Broadway. And so we rendered up there, and I got all the things a boy could want. I got not only did I have random access, now I had real-time rendering. And the dream back then was, you hardly think about it anymore, but the desktop metaphor was the revolutionary thing, right? Apple's idea of leveraging the real world, that you leverage things people know about, like their desk and the world, and that will allow them to communicate the organization of and mimic the organization in their brain. And so, there was a point at which, it was like, the apartment top metaphor, that, that the metaphor would extend, that, computers should not only attend to things that are in your office, like a desktop, but should attend to the rest of your life. And that we should have this physical world that will be a place for people to overlap. And so with real-time rendering, we could conjure any kind of environment. And so I built a thing where it looked like a little Prince world, where there was a planet with a Zen temple and I can't remember all the things in it, but it was like a community on this green planet. And the name YORB came from Your Orb. So it was a little bit like YouTube, except Your Orb. And the bit of the interface that I really still love, and I think we should do that with this YORB, is the circularness of it. So I love the way that God made the earth round. I'm not sure the Earth is round, but I do think that it's a good interface because you keep going. Like in this interface, when you get to one end of 370J, when you want to go to the other end, you have to go back around. In any case, we just got up to all sorts of shenanigans with YORB because it was meant to be a platform to bring people in. And so people could fax into it. They could modem into it, which was a big new thing. They could leave voice messages into it. And one at a time, people on Manhattan Cable could navigate in and see all the content that people had left in there during the day in the different places. So I forget how long that ran. A couple of years. There was a bunch of people. Naiwei Shu, Lily Chang, Eric Fixler. There were just a bunch of people who were involved with that project, and I'm missing so many people. But the problem with that whole idea, and the problem that I'm still working on to this day, is, the desktop metaphor has some value in that we believe in time and space, and we, have this 3D world that we navigate, and so much of our body and our mind have been evolved to make sense of it. And you leverage that when you have a physical metaphor like that. And so there's great value in that. On the other hand, the thing that you're giving interface to, your consciousness, is not stuck in time and space. And it doesn't want to be, it's the only choice for getting from here to there is, putting things in this kind of embodied way. But the thing that you're trying to convey in the first place is very unembodied. And so, the thing that won out was not the desktop metaphor. I mean, when you guys use your computer, you go to Google, you just type stuff in. It's like what came before the desktop metaphor, which is just like the command line. And so you don't, the impossibilities compared to 3D space that can be in your consciousness are, in fact, depicted in computational media, but they're not very well reflected in 3D Cartesian space. And so, that's kind of, it's funny that I got started being so excited about, kind of virtual worlds. And now it's more complicated because I just feel like VR today, being so slavishly devoted to navigating Cartesian 3D space is missing the point. But this current iteration of YORB is drawing on all those cues that we evolved to want to turn our neck and to be able to move from one conversation to the other in a more analog, continuous way than Zoom allows. To hear people a little bit or a lot, or to convey our interest in talking with someone by just moving towards them. It's just leveraging a wealth of kind of primitive human ways of understanding the world that are lost when you abstract the interface. So that's where I'm at, in the same old place. You have to, the only thing that we have is being embodied, thus physical computing. But the thing we're trying to ultimately convey and depict is this consciousness that is completely unstuck in time and space. So I haven't figured that out yet. Still
yeah, I think this question of metaphors is very salient, and I was just thinking about this.
I can't hear you.
Yeah, I think this metaphor question is very salient right now, and I think I had just been thinking about how the metaphors around the internet have changed quite a bit. In the originating days of the internet, it was the information superhighway. You surfed the web. You did all these very physical activities in a sort of metaphysical space. And so the metaphors we used to talk about it were physical. But now I feel like the metaphors for the internet have become much more fantastical. You worry about trolls. You worry about people ghosting you. It's almost like the internet's become some kind of dark forest full of violent creatures that we don't understand and are sort of beyond our comprehension. And so I wonder what that shift means for the net, and what kinds of new models we're developing to understand it, and what kind of new models we should develop to understand it.
I never thought of that. That's interesting. And another thing that leaps to my mind as maybe slightly related to that is this idea of deep learning, the deep dark place. And it's accurate that machine learning models are opaque. They are black boxes. And so that's another kind of dark web, troll. All those things you mentioned are about these kind of mysterious, dark, unseeable places. And, I think that's how human beings are. So, 90%, you think that you think all the things you think, but you don't. Your body does it. It comes out of this unconscious place. And you are this big dark thing that you don't understand. Like you do stuff and then you make up a story like you wanted to do it, but you just did it. And so, I feel like in a way, machine learning models in the way that they don't really, it's inarticulable, or it is so far, this might change exactly how they work. In that way, they work closer to how you work. Because you don't really understand why you do what you do. So I feel like it might be a maturation for computational media to have a dark side, or to recognize that it has a dark side, or to have it to build a dark side. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like the dark side. I feel like it has a dark side, and in fact, we're sort of in a moment of techlash that is sort of reacting to that dark side, and that's actually something that I wanted to talk to you about today, which is I think in talking about YORB, you sort of mentioned how it was about democratizing media, and in fact, this is sort of one of the founding ethoses of ITP. Was Red saw the Sony Portapack. She saw the potential for the way it could change the media. It could change media from a one-to-many model to a many-to-many model. And then this had been a long-term goal, sort of countercultural thinking, and throughout the latter half of the 20th century. In some countercultural segments, mass media was seen as sort of an enemy of free thought. And one in which changing the rules of media to allow for individual expression into mass media discourse would really open up new avenues for thinking and open up new avenues for culture. But right now, everybody's worried about personalized media. Personalized media is sort of the enemy of free thought. It encourages conspiracy theories. It traps people in media bubbles, echo chambers, so given the shifting landscape, or the shifted landscape, and how sort of these cultural narratives have changed, how do you think the YORB of now and the YORBs of tomorrow can thread this needle? How do you think the next digital platforms can?
Yeah, it's a super interesting. It is super interesting time. It was, and I think Red was always a little bit ahead of her time in that, we were gung ho about democratizing media, and it was held out as like just an absolute good that giving everyone a voice would lead us closer to truth. And as I mentioned, she was a proponent in the early days of public access, but just kind of fell off it a little bit herself. And, it wasn't, I won't say it was elitist, but, she definitely thought some things were more worth listening to than others. And, the techlash has been so pronounced. It's probably the most important theme at ITP and IMA, certainly in the last couple of years, is like, it used to be just fun, just make it whatever, let the users decide. There isn't, this isn't, cancer research. We're just having fun here. And then, as soon as, Facebook wasn't for keeping up with your college roommate, it was for electing our president, it got serious. Mm-hmm. And, whereas, our culture used to be, oh, you don't have to worry about criticizing it too much. It doesn't make much difference. Let the users, let the audience decide. And now, we might be a little closer to like architecture school, where if you don't build it right, it's dangerous. Mm-hmm. And expensive, and it's a problem. And so that's another maturation, I think, in our culture at ITP, and it's hard. Mm-hmm. But when things are hard, you should run towards them. Those are the things that you need to do. That's what is that's where the learning and the progress is going to be. Mm-hmm. For an old person like me, it's you get cranky and you say, oh, in the old days it was so much fun, and now we have to be so serious. But we do. And, this is important stuff. The bubble is, to my mind, the bubbling, the filter bubbles, the number one problem in the world. Mm-hmm. That people can customize their reality. That random access move to, personalization, move to, I'm just going to think my way, see what I want to see. And that, back to, the maturation of being more psychologically sophisticated, computational media, developing a dark side, I think is one aspect of being psychologically more sophisticated. The other thing is realizing that people do not take in the world, they construct the world. And so if you give them the ability to do that, they will just construct their own custom reality. And that's, of course, just another way of saying what the filter bubble is. Mm-hmm. So the challenge is, how do you build a system that enforces overlap between people who aren't necessarily going to agree? And does an environment like this, like we're sitting in, do some of that? And I think, one level it does it at is back to embodiment. Like, it's pretty easy to hate people on the, it's pretty easy to hate people on the basis of like a slogan, right? Mm-hmm. Like Twitter. Yeah. But it's actually kind of hard to hate people who are kind of staying in front of you. Mm-hmm. Unless they're like threatening you or something. When you encounter someone as a human being, it's really it's much harder to hate them. So I think any kind of interfaces that give you more of an embodiment and you become less of a slogan, the interactions, just proceed with more good faith and the ability to, I don't know, to try on ideas and that sort of thing. The problem with this sort of environment, though, is it doesn't have the power of the internet. We are still stuck in time and space here. Mm-hmm. The thing that I keep talking about, your consciousness, is a very multidimensional space. And you can, the thing I was talking about with my photos at the beginning, you can look at them by time or by place or by person. Your mind can look at something by, 50 different dimensions. And computational media can also afford that sort of combination or representation of things. But it somehow has to be flattened into a screen, that multidimensional space.
Yeah.
And is there a way that you can overlap in more meaningful dimensions than X, Y, and Z? Like the X, Y, and Z of 370J is not that controversial. Mm-hmm. But, and so, just to get to my own kind of work, in open source cinema is, stories are the way that we can very easily create reality. And if I have an interface for creating a story and I put, a guy in there with a truck, and someone else is creating the same story and they put the person in there with a pickup truck or a Volvo. Mm-hmm. That's suddenly the dimension of, like a guy with a gun rack and a guy with a, safe automobile. Mm-hmm. What is the difference between those stories? And everything else is the same. But suddenly there's this sort of like, you can, one thing I reference a lot is like a metaverse where, every possibility is coexisting at the same time. And you can slightly diverge on one dimension, but you overlap on all the other dimensions. So that, that's the research I'm looking at, is how can you have a space where people share most of a story? And it's not a matter of I watched this whole movie or I watched that whole movie. It's like I watched that movie, but mine was slightly different than yours. And so there's more overlap. Right now the overlap on Netflix is basically, title and genre. That's how you can sort things, actors, things like that. But what if it was within the data of the movie that you could interact? So those are the two places where I hold out some hope. One is more embodied interfaces, just because it's harder to hate a body than a slogan. And the other thing is some sort of interface that allows us to overlap in more subtle ways than just, which channel you watched.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sort of these questions of narrative, and I think we should wrap up pretty soon. But I've just two more.
Sorry, I've been going on.
No, it's
interrupt
good.
Me.
I like to see where you end up. I don't want to interrupt because there might be you might be walking out into a meadow that I don't even know about. So I think the sort of narrative and sort of the connection of computational media to cinema, I think is very interesting. And, and I feel like this whole area of new media used to be called expanded cinema. Like it was considered a part of film at its beginning. And I feel like something that I like so much about YORB and that I find compelling about the original YORB, is that it feels very much of that continuum. Like you can very much tell that it has a place in the the video canon. To me, I see a direct connection from YORB and from other video experiments and video art that were happening on local access TV to sort of modern cultural practitioners on YouTube and TikTok. And so, do you see any hope in those platforms, or do you think they?
You are.
I guess what I'm asking is.
You are.
Is how do you see your fitting into this sort of
history
of video work and video on the internet? Within the film canon. This is sort of an open-ended question. But,
You actually went.
Yeah, certainly when YORB was born, and by the way, YORB, then after I left YORB, a guy named Nick West took it over, and I'm sure you're going to talk to Tom because Tom worked then with Nick West, and he took it in a more pixel-based direction. So it was real-time rendering, graphics, and he took it back out towards pixels. And, I think that's a strain back and forth is, pixels versus vectors, basically. And, when I started, certainly cinema was king, and I think it still is king. I think the stories of our culture are largely conveyed still through narrative, pixel-based media. And the thing I love about cinema, and the reason I use cinema in the title of one of my classes, is I feel like cinema is so much more psychologically sophisticated than VR, in that, just cutting is something that doesn't freaking happen in life. Like, your head doesn't open a door and take a wide shot, and then your head doesn't zoom in right next to the person and then zoom into their hand when they look down. It does not at all try to represent what happens to you in life. It tries to represent what the attention of your mind does. And, it's so interesting that your mind forgives that and doesn't see these cuts that are utterly crazy compared to any experience that you physically have ever had. So I love the liberties that that cinema takes. The thing I don't want to bring along with cinema is pixels. I kind of hate pixels because they're just not computationally accessible. The computer, you either take them or leave them. I don't know anything about that pixel. It's not reusable by someone else. Entities are reusable. So I want to take the good, and I shouldn't say the good. I want to take what I can use out of cinema and leave the rest. But the thing I really like is the way that cinema takes liberties that VR still refuses to take. Like in VR, you get a 3D space that you're expected to travel through. And that is, 3D spaces are not controversial, and traveling is not something your brain wants to do. Your brain wants to conjure, it wants to instantly move from here to this idea. And cinema affords that. I'm very interested in virtual reality as long as the word virtual just means, quickly changing reality. So that, I don't. It's really the same trade-off of embodied things versus unstuck in time things. Is the same dynamic between kind of a vectorized world versus a pixel-based world. And, sometimes I think, in between those things are some of the things you see, like volumetric display and that sort of thing, where you're kind of getting the best of both worlds, where, you're getting the skin and the skeleton being a little bit more computationally useful, and the skin being more impactful to people, and also, frankly, appealing to a culture that exists of filmmakers. They like pixels. They know how to tell stories. Let's bring them into this world, and they like pixels. So it's navigating that is there's no clean way. You have to steal a little from all different cultures.
That reminds me of I think this is something you said in Rest of You, which is a class I took with you, that I think about quite often, which is that if you said if you really want to reach out and grab somebody by their soul, make a movie. Don't make a website. And so I feel like I've thought about that a lot in terms of my own work and sort of the directions I want to move in. I think we're almost out of time, and I just had one last question for you, and this might be a little bit controversial, which is so you've been in ITP for so long, you've seen so many different classes. What's the best class that's ever been taught at ITP?
Last night at graduation, I told you that the class of 2020 was the best class.
Oh, not the best class. I mean the not the best year class, but the best in the classroom class, so physical computing or
right. Oh my God! Oh, that is so hard. There's the faculty sit there and gouge each other's eyes out trying to pick the lineup of classes, and then we all wish that we could take them. What is the very best class that's ever been at IT? I can't pick among my children. That is too cruel a question. I do think that physical computing, as rendered by Tom Igoe, probably is the thing that grounds us, in this tension that I've talked about through this whole interview. Computers have the potential to depict this multidimensional, unstuck in time and space thing that you have in your mind. And, that is the tempting direction to go in as a computer person. And I guess in general, the curriculum of physical computing reminds us that, hey, get as lost as you want in your head. You are stuck with your body and this construction of time and space if you want to reach other people. So I'll say physical computing.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. And any last words?
Thank you all for going back in time. I forgot all this existed. It's so awesome. And it's interesting. And it's funny. I've been going back and looking at the beginning of cinema, different books about that. And they didn't know how things were going to turn out. And it's interesting that they projected some of the thinking that people are doing in AR and VR into what film might become. So I think it really is worth going back and looking at some of the original ideas to see, hey, maybe some roads were missed that are worth re-going down. So thank you for the work on this.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. Please clap.
And thank you to the whole YORB team for giving me a place to be right now. Awesome.
Oh, you're welcome.
And turn my head. It feels great compared to Zoom.
Karaoke. We gotta have karaoke in YORB.
All right, that's been Dan O'Sullivan. Thank you all. We'll catch you at our next edition of yorb.itp.io interviews. All right, thank you, everybody.
Bodies in the sand, tropical drink melting in your hand. We'll be falling in love to the rhythm of a steel drum band. Down in
YORB 2.0.
Jamaica, ooh, I wanna take you to Bermuda, Bahamas.
2.0.
You get there fast and then we'll take it slow. That's where we wanna go. We gotta
YORB 2.0.